Sam Scott is our speaker today. He's from, is it, so I've not actually heard it pronounced. Is it Oso or Oso?
So
Oso. So Oso HQ, I think, is the name of the company. Um, and you're the CTO, I believe, and co-founder.
that's right.
And so you're going to be talking to us a little bit about authentication with Node. And I've noticed also you do a lot of other programming too, like including Rust, which will be including a talk at my other meetup later on this year. But we're all looking forward to tonight. So without any further ado, I'll hand everything over to you.
Nice. Thanks, Brooke. So, okay. Yeah, thanks for the intro. So yeah, I'm Sam, co-founder and CTO of Oso. Small corrections. I'll actually be talking about authorization, authentication. And I have some slides on the difference between them because um, they are easy to get confused and often get kind of get mixed up. So yeah, just a little bit, about me and the company Oso. So we're a startup. We're based in New York, sort of now also partly remote, due to COVID times, but also people moving around the country, things like that. And as a company, basically our entire goal is around making security more accessible for developers. So creating open source software, libraries, tooling that allows you as a developer to go and implement security like in your application with confidence that we're helping you to do the right things and you can kind of focus on how your app should work instead of worrying if you've necessarily done your security right and you're going to leave yourself vulnerable. So to that end, there's a few things I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'll do a little background on some topics like authentication, authorization, talk about the difference, what those mean. I'm going to kind of assume not too much prior experience, so bear with me if you heard this all before. Um, I'm going to go a little bit deeper on authorization than most people probably have heard, so I'm sure there'll be something interesting for people. I'll talk about Oso, um, the software, the company and the software, things like that, and how it fits into this picture. I'll get to that later. And I kind of want to share as well because I think it can often be nice. I know the thing I like about a meetup is you sort of have this more of a kind of personal connection with someone. You kind of want to see like what's the beating heart of the project. So I'm going to talk a bit about how Oso is made. Um, the core of this is actually written in Rust, and we integrate with Node through WASM, and I know that's often been quite a popular topic. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit briefly. Okay, so authentication authorization. So you're on your phone, you're on your computer, whatever. You go on your device and you enter. You go onto the website and it asks you, who are you, and you put in username Sam, right? And maybe you add into your password. That piece is authentication. So like, who are you? Authorization is the following piece. Like once you know this is Sam, what can Sam do? Can Sam read document 12? Maybe yes. Can Sam read document 4? No. Okay, so that piece is the authorization. So in an example that maybe you'll be more familiar with, right, in something like GitHub, authentication is when you go to the GitHub website and it asks you to enter your username and password. I type that in, do my two-factor authentication, and I'm now logged in as SamScott89. So I've authenticated that I am me, basically. Now GitHub knows who I am. It needs to decide what I can do inside the GitHub website. And this is where sometimes authorization maybe won't be as obvious as authentication is, maybe something more in the background. So the only way I could really show you this happening in something like GitHub is I tried to visit two URLs. One is for the OSO HQ's teams, so my organization, the teams, and the other was for Nest.js, which is a project a Node framework that I've been trying out recently. Now, I'm a member of the OSO organization, so naturally I can go and see the OSO teams, right? So I go to the page and it lists them, I have visibility. But I'm not a member of Nest.js, I don't have any affiliation with them, so instead it gives me this little banner to say, you're not a member of any teams in the organization, and doesn't show me that. So it has made an authorization decision there. It's decided that, yes, I can see OSO teams, no, I can't see Nest.js teams. So as a developer, someone building, maybe full stack, you're building your Node app, building your Express framework, like there's kind of a question of like, why should you care about this? Now, yes, like authorization is, it is a security concern, right? So this is an area that people like very commonly get wrong. There's a pretty large breach at Twitter a while back, which is around, an attacker was able to go in and use some credentials they exploited to be able to post as like famous or like verified Twitter accounts. You can go on like bug bounty boards and find a bunch of like authorization issues that people have had. This one from the US DoD. So this is, it's a hard thing to get right and lots of people make mistakes. But for me, it's not just about security. Like, yes, at the end of the day, we want our apps to be more secure. We want to do things right. But there's kind of a piece of this is actually more just about the enjoyment in building an application. And I know security is often not a very attractive or fun thing that people want to work on. And that's because sometimes you might end up with your like authorization permissions logic, which looks like some giant switch statement with ifs and conditionals and comparisons and things like this. And maybe it just becomes a piece of the code base that no one wants to work on because it's like, oh, I don't want to touch that. It breaks all the time. Everything goes wrong. Like, I don't want to have to think about like, if this person's an admin or a guest or owner or whoever they are. Like, I want to build my app. And so for us at OSO, this is like one of the big pieces of, one of the reasons we care about authorization is actually making it something which isn't quite so painful to work on and that can actually be sort of enjoyable. The kind of other piece of this is when you end up with code like this, over time, what we've seen, having spoken to many companies at this point, is they go through these cycles of basically refactoring this code base. Every few months or every year or so, they'll undertake these big projects to rip out what they previously had and add a new feature and upgrade everything. And we're trying to avoid that by giving people the tools from the beginning. So to that end, we're building OSO, which is the name of the company, but also the open source library we have made for authorization. OSO is actually available for a number of different languages. So we currently support Java, Ruby, Node, Python, and Rust, with GoSport soon on the way. And basically, in a very, very brief summary of it, it looks like this. So at the top here, I have an example of the policy code. So you express your authorization logic using our policy language called Polar. And so that's what I have at the top. And I'll talk through this in a second. And basically in your application, what this allows you to do is just call this very, very simple API, oso.isAllowed, and you pass in your data effectively. You pass in the user and the thing they're trying to do and what they're trying to do it to. And so basically what this policy at the top here says is me expressing my authorization logic for who should be able to do what in my application. So this one says that a user can read a repository if the user is the repository owner. And so you can see there's a few things going on here. One is we have these colons, colon user, which might look similar to if you've seen TypeScript, for example, the TypeScript types. And is indeed like very, very similar. So we're actually checking the input types that match a user or a repository in the case of the second one. And the second thing is we're reading off attributes from those and comparing things. So we're checking, is the user the repository's owner by reading the owner attribute of the repository and comparing it to the user. And these fields are coming directly from the variables that we're passing in, the data we passed in from our Node library. So they get passed in as JavaScript or TypeScript types, objects, whatever it is. And this logic here at the top is expressing what you can do over those. So I'll show this in, yeah. So I'm going to show you this in a very, very simple example application I've put together for this meetup. Where are my pages? There we go. Okay, so I'm inside a little Express application that I generated using one of the, I can't remember now, one of the sort of Express code gen things to like scaffold out the application. And I've added a simple endpoint to get a list of repositories. And so you can see, I'm sort of, first I'm going to get all my repositories. I'm going to read the current user off of the request. And then I'm actually going to iterate through all those repositories and check that the current user is allowed to read that repository. If so, I'm going to add it to this list of repositories that get returned to the user. So this is my like API entry point, right? The idea is it's an endpoint where I can get all repositories that I'm allowed to see. And okay, so as I said before, this OSO is allowed call is using the OSO library along with the policy files you write to determine if this should be allowed or not. So right now, this is my policy file. I'll make it a bit bigger. And here's my website. If I refresh this, and this is empty right now because I have no rules. So denied by default, nothing's allowed to happen. Okay, so I've just said nothing. No one's allowed anything ever. I'm going to go to the other extreme, and I'm going to say for a user, an action and a resource. And these are just like function argument, function parameters. Basically, it's the same kind of idea. These are just variable names. And I'm just having a colon on the end here, which I'm saying actually allow everybody with no conditions. So this is my new rule. I'll take my node up a second to restart. Cool. And so now when I refresh this page, I've got my two repositories that are all the repositories I've got in my little data, my example. So I can now see the React website and the owner is Sam, and the SQL things repository, the owner is Gordon Freeman. Okay, so this is a very permissive rule. And actually you'll kind of see in the bottom left here that OSO has helpfully kind of warned us that we've got all these inputs that we're not actually using. So we should probably do something about that. So let's say, so maybe the action can be read. For now, I'm not going to use the user, so I'm just going to put an underscore to say that I don't care about the user right now. And I'm going to say that, let's just say all users right now can read, let's make sure this is a repository. If the repository, I don't know, let's say for the repository name is SQL things. And so again, right, so I'm reading off the repository data item that was passed in that we just saw a second ago from the Express app. I'm reading off the name field from it and checking that it's equal to SQL things. And now I refresh my page, and it's indeed filtered down. And kind of this is the core of it, right? So this is a pretty bad example, but maybe I'll change something a little bit more realistic, where I want to check that the user ID is the repository's owner ID. That sounds like something a bit more practical. So we're saying users can only read repositories if they're the owner of it. And again, we're sort of checking both user ID and the repository's owner ID. And this time, there we go. So the current logged in user is me, is Sam, and I'm the owner of the React website, so I can see it. And so basically, in a nutshell, this is the kind of core idea behind OSO is giving you this ability to like separate your authorization logic, so rules about who can do what inside your app, from your application code, so that you can leave your inside your controllers, inside your views, inside your routes, and all that kind of stuff. You just have that one simple OSO is allowed method, and that can be applied anywhere generically. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do with it. Print. So for example, I also have this like middleware setup that would, if I uncommented this code, is going to run this on every single request, check that the user is allowed to check the request and things like that. And it kind of really allows you to have this like cleaner pattern of, my application can focus on the business logic and my rules can focus on authorization. There's kind of a second piece to this, which is around managing complexity, right? So I showed you the earlier case. I might just pull it up again quickly, where I had this sort of case statements and ifs and else's and things like that, which can get very, very hard to maintain very quickly. So this language Polar here is actually a declarative logic-based language, which means that you don't need to like tell it. You don't need to tell it like if else, like if this, then do this, else do this. You kind of you express like what you expect to be true in terms of these like rules, and you can kind of write multiple of them. And the idea is like OSO is the one doing the sort of search throughout them. So if I had some other rules, maybe this one is just something like if the user is the admin user, then they can read any rules. Then again, when the decision needs to be made around should the user read this repository or not, it's got both rules. You don't need to tell it which rule to check. It's going to pick both of them for you. And as this gets like more and more complex and you have more logic you're trying to represent, this actually stays very relatively simple. And I'll show you a sort of more a more fleshed out, built out version of this later after I talk a bit more about some authorization patterns. Okay, so that's the sort of super quick intro to OSO. The next thing I want to talk about is roles, and this is kind of continuing the theme of talking a bit more about authorization and authorization patterns in an app. So the idea of roles, or you might have also heard this called RBAC, this acronym ABAC, it comes up a lot, which just stands for role-based access control. The general idea is if you have, you have a bunch of users, you have a bunch of resources, and you want to decide who can do what inside all that. Now, instead of individually going for every single user and assigning and saying what they can do, it's a lot easier if you can just group them in one big category. So I'm just going to say, well, these users are all members, and these users are admin. And then from there, I can decide, I don't need to care anymore, like how many users there are in these buckets and specifics about them. I can just assign permissions to those roles, those kind of groupings instead, right? So I could say members are allowed to read and write documents or repositories. Admins can delete them as well. And what this does is actually gives you like a very intuitive way to express permissions to an end user. This is such a common thing. Most people are probably familiar with having experienced this and use this in various forms. But you can imagine the alternative is if you kind of have this like long list of permissions of things you're allowed to do that you need to understand. Again, so building from kind of the simple example to one maybe more practical. This is, you might have seen a kind of a matrix like this. This is from GitLab. And for example, they have these five rows along the top, and there's a ton of things these different roles are like broken out into doing. And this is because GitLab is a large product, does everything from like source control to CI and testing to deployment, things like that. So there's understandably a lot of complexity inside GitLab, but they've reduced it to just 5 roles. And these roles I feel like very naturally link to what you'd expect to be able to do inside, or like who you are, or like what you'd expect to do inside an organization or a repository. So like naturally, if you're the repository owner, you own it, you can do everything. If you're a guest, probably just got some limited read access, right? You're just a guest. You're not going to start like editing things. You might expect, a reporter is allowed to like open issues, but maybe can't quite do as much as a developer or maintainer can do. And so what this kind of gets to is what are, in my opinion, some kind of best practices for building roles like systems. There should be a small number of them. They should be related to these like intuitive concepts of responsibility. Like as an end user of a role, you should be able to have a rough idea of what you can do inside an application just by knowing what your role is. And there's a final piece of this, which is that sometimes you can't get everywhere with a small number of roles, right? Like GitLab has 5 roles, but a lot of things you can do inside GitLab. So how do they manage to break it down to allow it to really give you sort of fine-grained access control? And it's this idea that instead of adding more roles, just have roles be able to apply to resources. And what I mean by that is like an organization or a specific repository. So whereas you might be, a member of an organization, and that means you can read all your repositories, there may be a couple of repositories that you're a maintainer of, and you have elevated privileges for those. So there's another term thrown around a lot called ABAC, which stands for attribute-based access control. So whereas previously we sort of took a user, we put them inside a role, and then we more or less kind of forgot about the user and just spoke about what the role could do. In attribute, you look at attributes of the user and the thing they're trying to access and make decisions based on that. So for example, you might say a user can read a document if they're in the same project, and we're comparing a project ID from the expense in this case against the user's project IDs. So anytime you see something like this, you're talking about attribute-based access control. The examples we did earlier where a user could read a repository if they're the owner, it's kind of somewhere blurrier. So, sometimes people talk about like, should you use RBAC or ABAC, or, what's the best approach to access control, which I think is sort of in some ways like a false dichotomy. It's because ABAC is like so broad that it just kind of refers to like any authorization you really are trying to implement. And, ABAC is great, but it's really more about like how you implemented RBAC, and do you have like a good concept of roles. And so me, it's actually all about trying to describe relationships that users have to the data. And you'll see that very much in like how I introduced policies earlier, and like how I've been talking about authorization. But things like I belong to a project, or I'm a member of a project, I created the document, or I'm an owner of a document. These are like much better concepts to have. And you kind of layer roles on top of that, and they're very good for differentiating responsibilities within that. if every now and then you may need like a bit of extra granularity, and attributes could be very good for that. So maybe you have like a protected document, which requires you to have a higher, high level role to be able to access. Like, only admins can edit protected documents, but anybody can edit regular documents, things like that. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit what that looks like in sort of an example application. So here I have an application built in Nest.js, which if you're not familiar with it, it's sort of another Node web framework. And I think it, in my opinion, it's quite an opinionated one, in quite a nice way, actually. It has a lot of it is really around sort of separation of concerns, breaking things out into separate pieces, and kind of allowing you to kind of build up an application by separating them out and like having each piece deal with just a certain piece of it, which kind of matches up very naturally with the sort of point of view we have around, OSO and authorization logic. So this application I have here is a sort of like document management app. So you have things like projects and documents, users belong to projects and they can create and edit documents inside them. So I wanted to talk through some slightly more complex policies, which I think hopefully will just give you an idea of the kind of power of being able to pull out this authorization logic, and also like a little bit more information around like how you might think about structuring roles in your application. So so I have this, let me start with this one actually. Yeah, so maybe here's a good example. Just trying to hide everything else from the screen. All right. So here I have a pretty simple rule, simple rule rather, which says that a user can delete a document if they have the owner role on a document. And really, this is like the kind of like a way, but a very simple way to build up like a kind of role-based access control system, but one which like covers all those things I just mentioned. So there's a couple of things going on here. I've said that the role, user has a role owner, and it's associated with the document. So already I've saying that my roles, have that kind of granularity on like a per document basis. You can see here that I'm kind of directly assigning like a delete permission to a role like an owner. And this pattern is like very repeatable. So you can kind of see this throughout this file that I'm doing, things like this. So for example, we've got some more complicated ones here. So maybe like a user can read a document if they have the guest role and the document hasn't been set as members only. So again, this is where we spoke about earlier, combining ABAC and RBAC and things like that. And so this kind of allows you to sort of break up your policies, so you have some sort of like more high level rules. And then the information around things like roles can again like come straight from the application and from those relationships that exist there already. So for example, I say that a user has the owner role. And again, this is another rule that I can use throughout my policy, like we just saw in the example before. So the user has the owner role for a document if the user ID is the document owner ID. So pretty simple. This is, very much akin to what we saw earlier when I said repository and owner ID, but I've like pulled it out into this common ownership, this role method that I can now use like throughout my policy. So this is kind of like a nice idea, a nice version of how you can kind of start breaking up the model into kind of reusable components. The other kind of pattern that comes up a lot with roles, which I think is an interesting one, is this idea of having like hierarchical resources. And so similar to in GitHub, I have like organizations and repositories. In this app, we have projects and documents. And so we might want to say, like, if someone has a role already for the entire project, someone is an admin of the whole project, then I don't want to have to go and assign them admin role to every single document individually. I just want to them to be able to inherit that permission directly from them having the project role. And so that's what's going on here. I'm defining this role rule again, and I say a user can have any role on a document if they have that same role on the project. And so, when we think around when this policy is being evaluated inside an application, you can kind of picture the branching logic that might be happening that you don't need to represent in your application anymore. So you look at a document, you say, well, is the user allowed to read this document? Well, it depends. Are they an owner of the document? Because owners can read it. Well, they might be an owner because they were directly, the person who created the document and own it, or they might be an owner of the project the document belongs to. But you don't need to represent that in your application code anymore. You just get to write it as a couple of these two rules here, and they'll just get kind of handled for you. Yeah, and the cool thing is, right, all this information is staying in the application, which is super important because suppose this document changes ownership. I transfer it from me to somebody else. By processing authorization directly in the application like this, it just happens, that happens instantaneously. There's no like synchronization process or like delay, during which like somebody might be able to get access he wasn't supposed to. Okay, so that's just like an idea of what this might look like in a larger app using things like roles. One of the things that we're trying to do at OSO is provide more and more of this just out of the box. So you don't even need to do thinking around like how to design this properly and like, is this going to be the right model for you? And actually, if you head over to the docs page, and I'll drop some links for these later, but you can go through some guides where we walk through our view of how to structure data model for roles, the policies you can build up, and how to apply these patterns in various different circumstances. And actually, something that we've been working on is making all this available for particular frameworks, like out of the box, or if you're using a particular backend or database that you can just sort of import the library and it works. So if that's like something you're interested in, and there's like a particular framework or something like that that you would be interested in seeing this with, like please let us know, or like open a GitHub issue. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to talk about was a little bit around the making of OSO. And I'm just going to kind of go through a little bit of this briefly. So the core of actually, I might do it I'll do it from the GitHub page. I think it'll be easier to read. So this is the OSO repository. As I said, everything I've been showing today, all of this, everything we're building is open source and available, and it's all inside this repository. And so you can kind of see, if you look at the breakdown of languages in the bottom right here, so approximately half of the code base is Rust. So the core language, everything I've shown you around the authorization language, the policy language rather, that you can write rules in, express things like that, that's all actually written in Rust, which is kind of a relatively new systems programming language that kind of came out of Mozilla sort of in the last like 10 years or so. And then you can see like some of the other languages we've been developing, which we have libraries built on top of the Rust core. And so, because earlier I showed you all the various packages that we have available, we kind of knew when we started out that we wanted this to be available. So like, no matter what language you're working in, there was like a consistent experience that you could just get this out of the box. And so for that reason, we built this like common core in Rust, and wanted to make it available, in different language libraries by like embedding that core. And so what this actually looks like in Node is that we have this Polar WASM API. So WASM, which stands for WebAssembly, is this kind of this idea of having a kind of a interoperable language, like a compilable language that's compatible with like JavaScript, so it can be run in in the browser or in Node, and that like other languages can target and compile to, and becomes a sort of interoperable point. So this is what we embed like inside the Node library. We have this this WASM API. It kind of looks something like this. It like basically wraps all the core Rust methods and like exposes them with particular JavaScript names. That's what's kind of happening here. And then in like the JavaScript folder, the kind of the nice thing here is what this looks like in, let's say, query, I think would be one. Maybe host. Yeah, so you see we're basically importing a type from that WASM code. So it's now the Rust code kind of gets compiled into this WASM thing, and it actually has support for like the type descriptions as well. So we just import it like straight into our JavaScript code as if it was just like another JavaScript library. And we're now like directly able to call all those methods that we exposed. So I can kind of see anywhere that I have this reference to something called FFI polar is me basically, is us making use of that that core, that Rust core. So yeah, so most things will call it through this. And the nice thing about this is, so this library has been, we've been working on this. It's been available for Node since we released it like 4 months ago. But recently we're actually able to get this working for browser-based systems as well. So if you go to the docs page, docs.osohq.com, and hit the banner at the top, because this is a kind of second version of the documentation site, you'll come and see the kind of new work in progress docs. And you can actually go here and start trying out OSO in your browser. So you see I got true here. So this is a policy just like I've shown before, right? It's taking in a user and an expense, checking the usernames, the expense owner, and the expense amounts, less than 200. And this is my JavaScript code, which is going to be evaluated inside the browser and actually run. So I'm creating a new user called Sam. The action is going to be submit, and the expense is going to be for travel for 100. So if I make this say 200 and then run this again, right? I'm getting false. So you can kind of see it like happening immediately. If I make this less than or equal to, we should be true again. If I say that it shouldn't be the expense owner, then it's going to be false again, and so on. And you can kind of see this module.wasm. If you look at the browser traffic, that's it downloading that chunk of wasm, this kind of like Rust code that's being compiled into wasm. And like many other languages, right, can compile down to wasm and make them like interoperable and useful in this state. This is kind of a nice thing that we got, which and it was actually a relatively small amount of work to go from the version we had compatible for Node to the version that we could run in the browser, all thanks to this, to the use of wasm. So it's kind of a nice, a pretty cool thing to play around with. All right, so that was all the things I wanted to cover tonight. I'm more than happy to go into any depth on any of the stuff I've spoken about, more. So whether authorization in general, like the OSO Node library, or like how we built it, and more on wasm. Here are some links for you can find us, so the website or the docs I was just speaking about. We also have a community Slack where we're kind of available to answer any questions around all the stuff I just mentioned. And given that we're also streaming this on Twitch, I kind of want to mention that on the 2nd of February, I'll actually be doing a Twitch stream talking about our recent Go integration. So it's kind of a work in progress. We've been adding support for Go, and I'm going to do a stream on the 2nd of February. You can either go to this link where there is a form that you can kind of put your email in and we'll remind you, or just come to the stream on the 2nd. And I might post this in chat if someone hasn't already, because it'll be hard to get that URL down. Chat's refusing to show up, so I will not be. All right. Anyway, that is my talk. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Sam. I have one or five. This was really awesome, Sam. Thanks so much. It's a good intro, and I do especially like the OSO as an organization sort of offers your opinion and has those docs around, just because as someone with a startup, we don't necessarily have the capital to have a security expert on our team. And so there's a lot of flying by night. I probably shouldn't have said on a Twitch recording, but it's always good to learn more.
We'll do it. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
We had someone actually say to us the other day, like, very much in the same mindset as a startup, like, can you just tell me, like, what thinking do I need to do and what code do I not need to write because I'm using OSO? Like, it's such a good way to put it. And so we're doing more and more down that route.
It's really cool. And I have kind of, I think somewhat of a contrived scenario that I would like just love your 2 cents on, if I may.
Sure.
So you talked about thinking about security authorization in terms of a user and like their relationship to resources.
Yes.
What do you think about something that begins to become like more abstract? So modeling this from the perspective of, say, I am like bequeathing this authorization to someone. Like, does Polar or OSO or you all do you include, say, like a time constraint? Is there some sort of, I'm a manager, I'm heading out on my post-vaccine vacation, and I have a minion who I'm going to give authorization powers for a little while? Or is that sort of just like a no-go, something that I should avoid?
So yeah, okay. So I have a couple of thoughts. So like the kind of the first thought is it very much depends on the kind of application you're building. I'd say a lot of the stuff I shared today is kind of like broadly applicable, but the kind of case that you mentioned, I think would be, you see that for maybe like an internal application, like inside a company, but you wouldn't expect to see that if you were building, say, like a B2B app. And so
Right.
I think a lot of our documentation and guidance often leans more towards the latter scenario for people building those like B2B ones. And so those kind of maybe have like some different cases. Like I wouldn't expect, Twitter to add that functionality to their app that you can sort of time out your account for well, maybe. Maybe they should. Maybe they should. So yeah, you can absolutely write. I mean, the Polar language is pretty powerful. You can use things like times. You can use comparisons to times, and because of like the type system, for example, you can support multiple different user types. So one way that you might want to represent this person on behalf of somebody else is by representing that as a new concrete type. So maybe it'll be this user has been granted by another user, and you can say your policy might look like the user allowed to do a thing if they have been granted permission by so and so has permission to do that in the first place. That could be the kind of policy to express, and it's kind of similar to how I showed the role style logic, where it does start getting quite like high level abstract. Like I said, uh, if you have this, if you have this role on a document, then you can do anything that the other role can do on a project, or vice versa, rather. Like those do start getting quite like abstract, and those are absolutely like possible to represent as these kind of, as these sort of recursive rules or things like that. Generally, so that's kind of piece one. This kind of second, maybe slightly more practical kind of response is anytime you have data like that you're expecting to be dynamic and changing, should be something that is kind of like managed inside the scope of application data. So like in a database or persisted somewhere like that. We typically recommend that the rules, the logic, everything we shared is kind of treated more like code. It lives alongside your source code. You work on it like source code, and if it needs to be, if you need to be changing information, it needs to be like reading, as you said, like this manager's away for a certain amount of time, then that's like ideal case for it to be stored in a database and referenced in the policy, right? So maybe the allow rule says like, allow if the user is not on holiday, and the on holiday rule is one that reads from the database and sees their like PTO, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your answer and taking my very vague question and breaking it down into its composite parts.
I mean, I absolutely love talking about this stuff in general, and I think we could probably go on this for a while on this one thing. So I will also point out that I do hold like office hours weekly on Thursdays. I can not share the link, but yeah, like I hold weekly office hours to talk about like anything from OSO or just authorization in general. If you just want like advice on, we're implementing something, we're not sure what to do. Our customer asked us for AD integration. What the hell is that? Yeah, happy to talk those. All
We
right,
have a
thanks,
question
Graham.
from Twitch chat.
Ooh.
Jason Kurt asks, can you talk about custom roles that users of the app might be able to contribute?
Yes, I absolutely can. So, my screen is, I've got like a Windows overlay and my screen is locked up, so I can't share anything. So I'll just have to not show anything and talk. So the kind of structure, so so first of all, we have documentation on this basically on the website, and it follows the same kind of patterns that you would want to apply for regular roles. So you can think of roles as being like a relationship between a user and a piece of data. So maybe it's an organization, and so that data model goes in your database. To go from you have your own static built-in roles, which maybe that relationship maybe has like an associated name field, role name fields. Going from that to a custom role is actually reasonably simple. You can just instead of that field being like a role name, it can be an index in a roles table where you can store any information about the custom roles. And so this is this is something that we've kind of been writing, kind of building up patterns for covering all of these different use cases and kind of compile not compiling, but sort of reducing them down to like the core pieces of like how does a role system work and like what are the main pieces, so that you can kind of like swap in these in and out those bits. Hopefully that makes sense.
Another question I have, and it's something I've seen in a couple companies I've worked at. Is there support for logging in as another user? So let's say you have like a customer success team, they can have a super admin role, but then they can mock login as another user, and then it goes through the entire security system as that other user, so they can see any problems.
Yes, and actually that's really good, and similar to the kind of thing that it's very similar to the one that Sean brought up as well, the kind of on behalf of or is impersonating, that kind of thing. It's one that I've really been meaning to write up an example on it, because it comes up a bunch. The thing to be super careful of is handling that is like losing information. Like if you lose track of the fact that it's someone impersonating someone, you can get into trouble. There was an interesting Facebook bug 2 or 3 years ago that came up from this. So Facebook has a feature where you can look at I think you can look at your profile as if you're somebody else to see what can that person see. Maybe you want to make sure that you've hidden the right post from them or something. And they had some sort of an impersonation system, but I think they impersonated too well, and it meant that you could, like, if you clicked on the upload video button, it would generate an API token to upload a video as the user you're impersonating. But that API token was like powerful enough that it could do anything. So it was through that kind of system that it meant that anybody could log in as anybody, basically. And so the kind of advice the kind of situation that I said to Sean earlier that I think holds here is how that would look in Polar is I would represent that as a separate type, like user impersonating other user. It would maybe have 2 fields, the original user and the person they're impersonating. Then you can be way more careful and kind of, you would want to like substantially restrict the kind of things that someone can do when they're impersonating. You can you'd probably want to make sure this is hooked up to some kind of auditing system. For example, I know of one company who had that kind of a system hooked up to like a Slack channel, so there'd be like a notification anytime someone did that, because it really should be a rare occurrence that someone needs to like full on log in as the customer and kind of see that data. I think it's actually the Twitter bug I mentioned, I think, has the same root cause at the end of the day. Is like internal employees could pretend effectively log in as any account, and it's it's kind of a There Be Dragons style use case to support. And basically what kind of, again, the idea we have with OSO and being able to express these things in the policy language is that you can kind of write it out as I explained it. It's like, okay, a user is impersonating another user. Why not I just express that in the rules and like the logic and like let it do its thing? And maybe I'll throw in some type checks there to kind of make sure that the flow is correct. Instead of this being something that kind of like you're trying to delicately thread throughout your application into various places.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Any other questions? Going once. Going twice. Oh, one more on Twitch. Jason Kurt also asks, is there any plan for a serializable version of Polar that could support storage in a database, etc., for dynamic programmatic manipulation? Would that even make sense?
That makes complete sense. We do company hackathons pretty regularly, and that was one of the teams worked on exactly that use case recently, because it's something it is currently possible, with some caveats, and you need to be careful with it. You can store the policy string in a database and load it and have per user rules and that kind of stuff. And we have had people who've been trying that out. But yes, we've been actually working on specific functionality to support more of that kind of use case, which is geared towards both kind of making things a bit safer, but also the kind of user experience. And I think the challenge with making policies very dynamic and allowing users to write them is you want that experience for them to be as good as possible, and they might not have, maybe they're doing that via web UI. They might not necessarily have available to them the same tools that you have as a developer in like a local environment. And so one of the things we'd want to do is like effectively make it sort of make the language smarter so that it can provide more guidance to a user in that kind of a setting, so that it can provide super good error messages or give them kind of less ways to make a mistake ultimately. But yes, it's definitely an area of like active interest, and we have a lot more thoughts. Oh, I should mention as well, we're actually hiring at the moment across a number of different roles, for a technical recruiter, technical writer, engineering, and engineering manager. The information's on the website, the links that I shared earlier, but osohq.com. In terms of the kind of things we're looking for, it kind of comes down to really two main things. There's there is both working on the language itself, that bit's in Rust. Rust isn't a requirement, but we do kind of want people who we feel like have done maybe another system language or something similar, or have like done a bunch of languages and can kind of show that they've got the capacity to pick it up and run with it. The other thing that we love and we are definitely looking out for is people who have worked on web apps and have experienced authorization, because the developer experience for all of this is kind of key to us. And I think there's no better way to kind of build something than if you've experienced the pain and how it can go wrong, and you want to help make that better. And so, yeah, but I'd suggest people go look at the website.
So something I guess like maybe a little bit of extra information. If after this entire pandemic is done, are these jobs going to continue to be remote, or are you going to be asking them to move to New York?
The positions are New York and remote. Yep.
So both.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for the clarification.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for coming out and giving the talk today. This was a really great talk.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we do this every third Thursday. I don't think that we have a speaker lined up for next month yet. So if any of you would like to talk, please send me a message. And stay tuned on the Meetup page for whoever we get, or if we end up having to cancel or anything, we'll send out messages there. And with that, We hope that you have a great night and a great rest of your week. All right. Bye, everyone.